And welcome, everybody. And welcome, especially Joanne, who's a Dharma teacher from California and has been a pioneer in trauma-informed mindfulness.
Yeah. So can you put on the song? Great. I'm putting on this song to prime my own pump. And as we listen, just keep noticing what goes on in the body.
Today, the kingdom of heaven held a festival for thousands of stars. I went up to the kingdom, knelt down and prayed that the anguish, the killing, the disaster in our poor land would end. Where have you been, little star? I've been looking for you everywhere, out of my window, among the dark clouds. Where have you been, little star? I feel so forlorn, like a small bird lost on a foggy island. It has been raining for nights, late night on the sidewalk. I see the silhouette of lonely red forms. I try to call your image from deep in my consciousness, while the rain and the wind continue to rage. Tonight as I bend over my desk, my head in my two hands, the wind has carried all the clouds away. The sky is clear, the rain has stopped, longing for your call. I'm surprised to see you there, you have returned, little star.
I've been looking at the stars in the distance. I've been looking in my heart for resistance. I've been searching in the self for existence. All alone by myself, reminiscing underneath the Bodhi tree. But it isn't only me, you and I, collective energy. How it's supposed to be, I hope to be the ocean tide, with my spirit open wide, standing on a mountaintop, see the world with open eyes.
I was so surprised to know that I'm a part of this. Sunrise, sunset, rain clouds, all of it. The journey of awakening, taking it with one step, one breath. Save all beings till there's none left. Suffering is painful, but I'm still the same fool, searching for the river while I'm swimming in the same pool.
Maybe we can find it, keep the light shining, walking on the path of ancestors behind me. If you could be the person who you are in your heart,
Would you grow a little bit?
or would you play a bigger part?
Love is a paintbrush, life is the biggest art, and I'm still the same kid, wishing on a little star. Love is a paintbrush, life is the biggest art, and I'm still the same kid, wishing on a little star.
Little star, I've been looking for you everywhere, out of my window, among the dark clouds. Where have you been, little star? I feel so forlorn, like a small bird lost on a foggy island. It has been raining for nights, late your homeland. Your voice has reached the stars, transformed to teardrops, trembling in the air, I'm standing deep and true. Countless little stars with diamond strong faith, you are like flowers blooming everywhere. My little star, you are back home. With tears in my eyes, I call your name and feel the warmth in my heart.
The whole mission accomplished. The entire mission accomplished. Oh gosh, guys. Thank you. So
That's good. So just notice again what's going on inside. It may be nothing special. It may be something, but notice the sensations. Because for me, this was a landmark event. This poem of Ty's highlighting what Ty went through as a young monk and how he had a faith in Buddhism, that Buddhism could really heal his country, and yet it was miserably failing at the time of him being a young monk, that the everyday life in monasteries was not speaking to the people who were suffering. At that time, there was devastation on every level in the country. There were rivers of people emigrating to the south in fear of the communists. There were a terrible famine that killed 2 million people. There were people rotting in the streets. People were fighting each other in families. Many of you know all these things already. But Ty was living a life that was right on the edge. He was running around doing everything he could to bring a sense of relief to people. And he was himself often suffering from trauma and depression. And he reinvented a Buddhism, renewed it in a way that met his needs as a human who was suffering trauma, and for those who he was working with, so that our lineage was reinvented, not like from scratch, taking the traditions and making them alive, and him being a laboratory of one, and then a laboratory of a sangha, to see what was going to work to make them functional. And so our lineage is very trauma informed. But it didn't come from that point of view. When I first started exploring the trauma-informed mindfulness, I was reading a book by David Treleaven called Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness, in which he's talking about all kinds of ways in which practicing mindfulness can get people into trouble. And I thought, wow, I've heard of some of these things before, but not all of them. And I think that our lineage needs to get itself trauma informed. But as I looked closer and closer, as I studied neuroscience, I could see through a neuroscience lens how many of our practices already embodied that sensitivity, but it didn't have the language to connect the dots. And so I set about trying to see which dots I myself could connect. So I want to talk a little about the body and neuroscience, but skim over almost all of it because they're just, there's a itsy bitsy bit of time. So this might be egregious to some of you who know more about neuroscience than I do, but in a 2-minute neuroscience overview, our neurology was developed over millennia of millennia. We evolved as hunter-gatherers, where what we needed to do to stay safe was to, in a split second, act fast, to run or to fight or to shut down so that we didn't kind of implode ourselves with overactive hearts and lungs. So that what our nervous system was evolved to do was to respond in a split second to immediate problems. But that doesn't fit the way our civilization has evolved. But we're still stuck with the same nervous system of a hunter-gatherer. And so it's a trick to try and overcome some of those automatic responses because they don't work anymore to keep us safe. Running away or fighting isn't what we need in the vast majority of the problematic situations. And our nervous system is meant to hyperfunction in those situations where we have a real physical or emotional threat. And the rest of the time, it's meant to problem solve, to relate to each other, to figure out what's the best way to stay alive. And yet, many of us find that our habit energies take us over as if we're under threats that we actually know cognitively we're not under. And so it's bewildering why we can't focus when we feel perfectly relaxed. Why is our mind jumping all around? Why do we end up in certain situations, whether they be physical or social, where we feel freaked out and we're confused about that? And so learning about neuroscience helps us understand the issues that are at play. If we define the nervous system as having basically 3 parts, there's the part that's automatic. This is our body. So this is the part of us that knows that we can keep our heart going, we can breathe, we have balance. This happens whether we're conscious or not. And then we have a part of our nervous system that watches out and assesses the degree of threat. So where this is survival, this is kind of an emotional take on the amount of threat that we're experiencing in this moment. And this part is called the limbic system, and it's deep inside our brain, our head, which is like that. So this part is what we think of as our cognitive self. It does thinking in terms of what is happening, what is the story, what senses are we noticing? And it's great for problem solving, it's great for relating to each other, for communicating, for creativity, for ease, and it only functions well when this part of the brain feels at ease. And you can see it almost disappears when you stimulate this part. So this part is constantly watching for things that it remembers could be dangerous or are simply like something coming at you very fast. And then automatically we react from this nervous system of this one. When we're under threat, this is automatic. This is also where we have our habits. So our habits are automatic. They're not all responses to threat, but they're responses to stimuli in the environment. So automatic, oh, I have a little growling in my stomach, and my arm automatically reaches for the refrigerator door. It might not be the best moment, but I find myself there and go, wait a second, because I'm not in a threat, so I can still use this part and say, why don't you wait a while? So a trauma is when we find ourselves automatically responding to some threatening stimuli, or when there's no stimuli that we're aware of that's a threat, and yet we're still responding with that habit. So for instance, the classic example is the Vietnam vet who hears a lawnmower outside and finds himself sequestered in the closet, terrified, because there is actually no threat. And he may even realize there's no threat, depending upon the extremity of his trauma, but he has an automatic response to keep himself safe. And it was set in motion by circumstances that happened previous. Now, not all traumas are so obvious. Some traumas are spread out over a long period of time, and they're seemingly small, not quite enough breakfast, day after day after day, or not being warm enough, day after day after day, or people looking at you strangely, and maybe you are part of a marginalized group, and this happens constantly or intermittently. But those things add up to habits of keeping ourselves safe. So then what about situations in which our ancestors or the people who raised us were in traumatic circumstances, and they are raising us to be afraid of those same circumstances when there actually isn't the same kind of threat? So you see parents who have been raised in harsh circumstances, whether it's war or poverty or racism, teaching their children to be afraid, either by actually explaining to them, you can't do this, or by punishing them, or by reacting very harshly there are all kinds of ways in which we take in these intergenerational traumas and even historical traumas so that we may have a culture that's based on customs that developed during times when there were traumatic circumstances in the culture, whether they be famine or war or oppressions of other kinds. So if you think about it, there's probably no one alive who hasn't been the recipient of some kind of inheritance of trauma, whether you're aware of it or not, whether you were born with a silver spoon. Nobody who came to this country, or I shouldn't say nobody, but it must be the very rare bird who came to this country out of a sense of adventure, had it really easy crossing the waters, and landed here, had it cool. So we as human beings are the recipients of many, many, many generations of trauma. So there was a question, well, are we all traumatized? Well, that's the human condition. And some of us, it's more obvious and it's more egregious in this moment. But the fact is that we all have the same kind of nervous system. And whether we know what the trauma was or not, we can tell when we react inappropriately, meaning that we find ourselves doing things that are not beneficial, that we know that they're not beneficial, that there may not be any signs of why am I acting this way. It's confusing. And that Buddhism is really built from the ground up to dismantle all those pieces, whether it's the sutras or the various practices that we do, they all address the same stuff. And that when you look at what is the state of the art trauma treatment these days, it goes like this. You start out by making sure that you know how to regulate your nervous system so that you can feel safe. And we do that with a lifestyle of finding ways to bring up well-being and nourish those neural pathways, or as Ty says, those seeds deep within us, so that we can take refuge in them and they actually bolster our immune system. So once we have a sense of safety and a sense of wellness, then we can begin to look at the ways in which we have senses of ill-being that may be causing problems for us in our lives. So first, we have the job of centering ourselves, of regulating our nervous system, of even knowing when our nervous system is regulated and when it isn't. Then we have the task of how do we mindfully, with this part, investigate the ill-being. And so the neuroscientist, psychiatrist Daniel Siegel developed this idea of a window of tolerance, where we know that we basically are sitting in this part of our nervous system, that this part is calm enough to allow this part to function. Take a look at the time. So the time is running fast. So I will give a brief trajectory. You start with learning how to calm your nervous system. Then you learn how carefully to approach with mindfulness those senses of ill-being and how to become more and more at ease with a greater amount of stimulation from those difficulties. And gee, I feel slightly overwhelmed by the amount of time and the amount of material. And so I just want to say, for instance, if we look at the 5 contemplations before eating, it starts out with gratitude, with a sense of well-being that the universe is taking care of us. Then it moves on to what? May we eat in mindfulness. So we have to learn how to be mindful, how to be curious when things are difficult. And then what's the next one? May we transform our unwholesome mental formations. We learn how to do that. And then we broaden the view to the whole planet. Not only do we look at our own greed, but we eat in such a way that takes into consideration others, other beings on the planet, including our big footprint. And then we use that energy that we've gained from these to become engaged. And if you look at the Anapanasati Sutra, if you look at the beginning, if you look at the mindfulness, they all do the same thing. They all have that same trajectory. So we have created a little organization or a little community called Embrace, which is studying all the kinds of tools that will bring us back into balance, that will help us handle the difficulties, and that will recognize one of the most incredible things about being human is that we actually can regulate each other. And so it speaks to how important the Sangha is in holding the energy when we as individuals don't have that capability ourselves. So that kind of morphs us into Dharma sharing. And what is Dharma sharing anyway? It has many aspects, and one of them, I want to just look through this neuroscience lens, because Dharma sharing is a way to be witnessed. Trauma is often involved not only what happened to you, but the lack of social support that you had or didn't have at the time. So if we are finding that we're ill at ease and we come to Dharma sharing, our job is to stay within that window, to stay mindful of the way we express ourselves so we don't stimulate ourselves like this. And we are playing off the energy of everyone else who makes the vow to be non-judgmental, receptive, open-hearted, right there in the room. So we're watching, and our bodies are attuning to each other, and we're holding compassion for the speaker. So that is the main point of Dharma sharing, is for the speaker to do their best to stay within that window of what I call mindful opportunity, where we're not have energy, where we're not re-stimulating ourselves, but we're being able as best we can to share, and that we are witnessed by people with whom we can co-regulate, so that if I don't have the ability to, while I'm telling my story, I can watch you, or I can watch you, and my body will calm itself. So we don't interrupt each other. We listen carefully. We speak in a way that helps ourselves and others maintain confidence, joy, and hope. And we try and give everyone a chance to speak. We keep it confidential, again, for safety, for a sense of I can open my heart and have a non-judgmental presence, and I don't have to worry about the story being told somewhere else, so that that judgment inhibits me to be able to relax. So we've also experimented a little bit with telling people beforehand that it's not uncommon that we might get carried away with our own story, or we might get carried away with someone else's story. And therefore, we have a way of stopping in the moment and going back and noticing what's going on for me, whether I'm a listener or I'm a speaker, and use these tools that Embrace is promoting, which are only our practice, to re-regulate ourselves so we can be again present in the room. And we use the bell and a facilitator who is trauma informed, a facilitator who recognizes the signs in the room that people may need a break to go back to themselves, a facilitator who may recognize that a person is right at the edge of their own capability of holding it together. So just to say, we have study groups that are looking at trauma-informed mindfulness through a Plum Village lens. We have some trainings for those people who want to continue to learn how to facilitate sanghas with that stuff in mind. We have a little introduction that you can watch online if you want to get more of an idea of what a study group is about. And now we're starting to do retreats with this trauma-informed lens. And so I think I've gone on long enough.